Guild vs. Guild, or GvG, has officially been removed from Forge of Empires. A feature that once commanded the guild rankings and would bring the servers to their knees with the massive activity it would see is now gone. After 10 years of Guild vs. Guild, this news is crushing to those who enjoyed it, but has nearly no impact on the majority of players who never participated. To understand exactly why this is what went wrong with the feature and why it had to be removed, we must first travel back in time to 2014. Guild vs. Guild started on February 25th, 2014. It was the first feature to take advantage of guilds working together, as guild expeditions wouldn't even be added until 2016. With the launch of Guild vs. Guild, guilds had the option to battle across maps from the Iron Age through the Progressive Era, using only the units and goods of the same age as the map. As the game added new ages, so too were new maps added to Guild vs. Guild, up to the Future Era and then the All Ages map. You owned sectors which would each produce a small amount of guild power, which allowed you to level your guild. To take sectors, you could then siege by paying some guild goods and units. Then you'd have to defeat some defending armies in that sector before the enemy could defeat your siege army. While it is a simple concept, this feature resulted in massive battles of guild swapping sectors, clearing maps, and fighting for the rankings. When the rankings were still based on prestige, Guild vs. Guild played the largest role in a guild's rank. In fact, until Guild Battlegrounds was released, Guild vs. Guild was the primary source of prestige for most competitive guilds. Guild vs. Guild was huge at its peak. Despite being browser-only, it was also the place for the biggest guilds and strongest players to show their power. There were plenty of players logging on to get fights, and at 8 PM every single day, when sectors unlocked and the guild rankings were recalculated, they'd be on the maps ready to fight. In fact, it used to be fairly common for the game servers to get laggy after recalc due to so many fights happening and the sheer volume of players currently online. At this point in time, if your guild was competitive, then you were a guild that focused on Guild vs. Guild. Even for guilds made of mostly mobile players, you would have some of the players finding workarounds to play Guild vs. Guild on mobile devices, helping fund the guild treasury to allow the browser players to keep placing sieges and taking more sectors, or just leveling great buildings like the Observatory to build up the guild support pool. With every new age that came out, so too would a new Guild vs. Guild map. It would start empty with no guilds, but it wouldn't take long for guilds to spread across the map and begin once again battling using the units and goods of the new age. However, all good things have to come to an end. When Guild vs. Guild was first introduced, the game designers had only planned Forge of Empires up to the Future Era. This presented a problem. The Guild vs. Guild map was out of space for the next age, the Arctic Future. To fix this, they added the All Ages map. Unlike the other maps that require units of those ages, you could use units from any age on the All Ages map. This meant that it usually ended up dominated by whatever age was most recently released. However, this also meant that since the release of the Arctic Future in 2016, the only substantial updates to Guild vs. Guild would be nothing. Other than balancing changes, no new maps would be added, no new territory to conquer, no more space to fit more guilds. This is the moment that Guild vs. Guild started to die. Despite it still going strong for many more years, when a feature stops getting updates, regardless of how good that feature is, it will begin to lose players. Slowly at first, and then more over time as the feature continues to stagnate. It would be another 3 years until we learned just how far Guild vs. Guild had fallen. On May 19th, 2019, the developers posted a message on the forums about Guild vs. Guild. There's a lot of info, but the main gist of it is that Guild vs. Guild was not doing well. At that point in time, only about 5% of all active players in the game were still participating, while the number of those participating in the guild expeditions was over 10 times that. In essence, the amount of players participating in Guild vs. Guild on a regular basis was tiny. By my estimates of active players, fewer than 500 players per world were logging in and playing Guild vs. Guild every night. Again, this was in 2019, 5 years before the feature would be removed. 5 years for Guild vs. Guild to wither even further away. This lack of players was partly because Guild vs. Guild was a browser-only feature, but also because it couldn't scale anymore to adapt to new ages or new features. It was very hard to understand without help from other players or external sources, and it was a very time-dependent feature. If you weren't able to be on at 8 p.m. every day, too bad. This is when the Guild Battlegrounds were first introduced as a concept, then later that year brought to the game. This feature, unlike Guild vs. Guild, is playable on mobile and addresses some of the problems that Guild vs. Guild had. Play is not limited to just a short time after the 8 p.m. recalc time. It provides individual and guild rewards outside of just ranking points, and it allows negotiations. Not to mention, it also runs much smoother, is easier to understand, and even scales its difficulty with attrition, which Guild vs. Guild could never do. However, Guild Battlegrounds is not and will never be Guild vs. Guild. There's no real sieging, there's no defending armies or dropping sectors, and there are no age-specific maps. Players still debate over whether the lack of a recalculation time is a good thing or not, since it requires you to constantly keep an eye on the map throughout the day, and this can cause burnout. Additionally, around this time, Guild vs. Guild was changed too. The biggest change from a player's perspective was that dropping a sector would randomize the units in its defending armies. To not get too far into the weeds, you could grant a sector freedom or drop it and get back a few guild goods. However, you could then retake it and fight the defending armies that you filled it with, which basically meant that you could farm ranking points. Certain players used to take advantage of this to generate tons of ranking points from fights using champions. This change helped remove a major incentive of playing Guild vs. Guild for some of the higher players. Guild Battlegrounds would become the new place to farm ranking points and especially the unlimited rewards. Not to mention the ability of players to fight quickly in Guild vs. Guild and work together to take sectors in moments caused many reports and speculation of botting, alt accounts, and so much more. Many times, though, this was just guilds jumping into a voice call and working together to crush their competition. Of course, there were cases of actual cheating, but that's outside the scope of this video. As time progressed since 2019, Guild vs. Guild stayed an important part of guild ranking, but only continued to fall in popularity. I think it's telling that on my main world, US 26, I was able to single-handedly maintain a top 5, if not top 3, ranking for my guild in Guild vs. Guild. So few people played that there was little motion on the maps, and often nothing for me to do. While you might have previously been able to get guildmates to participate, now it just wasn't worth the trouble. And the fewer players that participated, the less active the maps, meaning fewer players would participate. On some worlds, guilds managed to lock down the beaches of each map. Think of this like a guild soft-locking provinces in Guild Battlegrounds to prevent you from being able to push forward in the map. On other worlds, Guild vs. Guild was still going strong every night, but overall the number of players participating was dismal. Whereas it used to be common to get lag on Forge of Empires between 8 and 9 p.m., everyone would be online and you'd see massive wars being waged. It was now quiet. Recalc would come and go, and very little would change outside of a scattering of activity on the All Ages map. This brought us to 2023, where we got a post announcing the end of Guild vs. Guild and an introduction to what would become known as quantum incursions. As explained in that post, the reasons for the removal of Guild vs. Guild were threefold. First, the feature had an extremely small number of players continuing to play it regularly, didn't meet the standards of a quality feature, and with the development time needed to improve it, the team would rather just create an entirely new feature. Second, Guild vs. Guild was still a browser-only feature, meaning that mobile players, the vast majority of the player base by this point, could not participate. This goes against the original goal for the feature. As explained by the late game designer Anvar in the Guild vs. Guild announcement video from 2014, Forge of Empires is always aiming to bring all kinds of players into one common game, and that is actually what we hope to achieve with this feature. Unfortunately, this didn't happen as fully as both developers and players may have envisioned. We can only hope that quantum incursions and subsequent features will be able to accomplish such a goal moving forward. Third, before a guild rankings change with the 2023 Guild Battlegrounds update, guild rankings would be overwhelmingly decided upon a feature that was platform specific, and that is not a good thing when most players don't use that platform. It was unfair to the mobile players. I would also add a fourth point to the list. Guild vs. Guild was stuck in the past. When the feature was first launched, events looked like this, and no event building would get attack boosts until 2015. In fact, at that point in time, the Shrine of Knowledge was considered strong. You couldn't even auto-battle from the army screen. Guild vs. Guild was designed and maintained with these constraints in mind. That left us 10 years later with a feature where fighting consisted of spamming auto-battle as quickly as possible, meaning sectors could be taken in a matter of seconds. The attack boosts that would have been formidable to beat are now laughable. Nearly any active player can beat the measly 75% maximum enemy defense boosts. It failed to adapt and improve to address a changing game. It was inevitable that Guild vs. Guild would need to be removed. Could the feature have been renovated to make it a core part of the game again? Possibly. But the fact of the matter is that it wasn't. It became a dated reminder of what the game had been, a piece of history existing only in the periphery. The players' response to the announcement of the removal of Guild vs. Guild was less than positive, dominated by the few players still remaining active in the feature bemoaning the news, while everyone else really didn't care. However, there is one conclusion that can be drawn from the pages of argumentative feedback. For those who did play Guild vs. Guild, it allowed them to connect with their fellow players from shared experience of the feature. At Recalc every day, Discord voice chats would fill with strategy plans and friendly banter. Guild goods would be spent, sectors exchanged, and wars waged. For the few who played it, the feature wasn't about the sectors on the map or the basic gameplay that consisted of just clicking fast, but rather the people who you fought with and against, and the bonds forged between players, guildmates, and friends. Then suddenly the end date had arrived. Like any other day, on March 16th, 2024, the voice chats were joined, the strategies planned, and the browser windows aligned for fighting. However, when the clock struck 8 o'clock, it would be for the last time. Sectors were taken, sieges were broken, guilds fought to protect what was theirs, and emptied their treasuries to expand their control over the maps. And 24 hours later, it was all over. The rankings were frozen, cementing some guilds in victory and others in defeat. Guild vs. Guild had come to its end. We can only hope that the lessons taught by the failure of Guild vs. Guild will be learned from and addressed by the new features introduced into the game, such as quantum incursions. Features that can be accessed by any player, regardless of platform. Features that can scale and adapt to address the ever more powerful event buildings we receive. But more than that, hopefully the positive aspects will be carried forward as well. Features that encourage competition and daily play without being a strain on one's limited time to play the game each day. Features that encourage cooperation and working together with your guildmates. Features that become so beloved by those who play them that they receive as much of an outcry should they be removed. I doubt there will ever be something quite like Guild vs. Guild in Forge of Empires again. Some will say that's a good thing and won't miss it, while others will remember it fondly. As time goes on, the number of players who played Guild vs. Guild will dwindle. New players will never know of its history in forging the game we play today. But the guilds this feature brought together and the friendships, or perhaps rivalries, that were born of the feature will remain. I hope you enjoyed this look back at Guild vs. Guild. If you want to see more historical videos about Forge of Empires, let me know. Head over to my Discord server, link in description, to discuss Forge of Empires and stay up to date on news and events. And as always, I'll see you all next time.